our main man, Mike Mitchell, posted this article. Can the XFL and USFL coexist in the same space? He put this out. This was before the big announcement of the team names, et cetera, et cetera. So we all know that the proposed leagues either failed to launch or taken down by ineptitude or circumstances beyond their control. So there's no guarantee that two pro football leagues, the XFL and USFL, will be around playing games at the same time in 2023, but they might. And once upon a time in a galaxy not too far away, it almost happened. You remember the XFL versus the AAF in 2020. Well, now we have that back. It was the AAF that was racing to try to get their product out there for all to see, and making all these partnerships, didn't really have any money. That was the main problem. But the Alliance wanted to get out there before the XFL. Now, fast forward, this mad dash happens again in a little different circumstances. The USFL is now pushing to get out there before the XFL launches in 2023. Sound familiar? Clearly, lots of different circumstances from the AAF and the USFL. AAF didn't have any money. USFL's got money and Fox. The AAF was on CBS, TNT, and the NFL Network, versus XFL was on Fox, ESPN, and ABC. AAF was paying to be on those channels versus the XFL shared the television networks, covered the cost, and the XFL was able to get the gate revenue. And I don't know how they split up the advertising thing, but the XFL did not have a TV deal where they were making money, and the AAF was essentially paying to be on television. And now with Fox, the Fox partnership, the USFL doesn't have to pay anybody, saving a ton of money. Plus the difference between the AAF and the USFL, they're playing in a hub city. Let it germinate a little bit. Get fans get interested, get advertisers interested, but maybe potentially team owners interested. This is a different approach to spring football than we've seen before. But remember, the XFL hasn't played, and the Spring League has played. They played last year, and Mike gets into that in a little bit. So we all know the demise of the AAF. Now we have the USFL's arrival. Now we know that, of course, Fox Sports basically owns the whole thing. We know that the birth of the current USFL all started with the XFL and Brian Wood's Spring League working together back in 2019. Fox's introduction and reinvigoration in the concept of a pro football league during the NFL offseason started with their introduction to TSL and their collaboration with the XFL. Remember, the USFL wouldn't be here if it wasn't for XFL and Fox. The Spring League's Brian Wood's creation, which aired games on Fox networks the last couple of years, has faded into the shadows. Fox initially came on as a minority owner of the TSL, but off the heels of what the XFL did on Fox and the meager numbers TSL did this past spring, Fox Sports, led by Eric Shanks, has decided to take the plunge head first. Brian Woods remains. We all know all the different players involved. It's expected that Joe Klatt and Brock Heward will be part of the USFL as well. Some of the rumored names for head coaching positions in the United States Football League are former Houston Roughnecks head coach June Jones, Steve Spurrier, he could maybe hit down to Tampa, Hal Mummy did great, and Jerry Glanville, all potential names. I would not be surprised if they didn't jump ship or go to that. I mean, y'all got to get paid. The interesting thing is that what does that leave the XFL and their head coaches? So XFL needs to make some moves to bring in these head coaches. I mean, if the XFL is thinking to wants to bring June Jones back to the Houston Roughnecks, they need to jump on that now, because he could be with the Houston Gamblers and be out. Remember that Roughnecks were one of the most exciting teams. P.J. Walker, Cam Phillips, great defense. Is there going to be a little competition? There would have been no competition for these coaches if it was just the XFL returning in 2023. Now there is, so it's something that we'll have to keep an eye on. This is the question that was raised in the article at XFL News Hub very early this year. Quite frankly, it's the goal of Fox. Much like the AAF attempted to, the USFL saw the viability of what the XFL produced in 2020, and not only did they want in again, but they wanted to take complete control by cutting out the middleman. It's what Brian Woods and TSL afforded to Fox that the current leadership of the XFL wouldn't. An opportunity for a major sports network to own and operate its own league. This is new. The USFL has has a chance, if run correctly, of course, to pose a more significant threat to the XFL than the AAF did, simply because the alliance was paying to be on the networks. Their house was made out of straws. The USFL is run by a robust network in the sports industry. Fox's house is one of the strongest on the planet. The bottom line is, with all these entities, is how all in are you really? Because as anyone knows who's followed this closely, it takes a lot of patience, serious financing to operate a pro football league. And, executives come and go. One of these guys gets ousted and replaced by somebody else. The USFL could just collapse right then on the spot. So first, to cut down the costs, they are doing the hub setting. Secondly, to buy the league time because it's not ready to go into individual markets yet, so they do the hub thing. And lastly, and most importantly, to showcase the league so the USFL can get owners and sponsors to buy into their teams, which is a kind of an interesting thing. Let's put the product out there first on a very low-level scale, see if we can get interest and excitement in these local cities, and then start to drum up support and slowly build. Brian Woods had said from the beginning when he was on the XFL Markcast, a slow build is the way to go versus jumping all out with guns firing like the XFL did in 2.0 era and looking like they're doing in the 3.0 area as well. Fox is earmarked to spend anywhere in the neighborhood of 100 to 150 mil the first couple of years. We're here in 3 years, 150 million. That's $50 million a year. Quite frankly, it's a strategy that can work if Fox is willing to pay their players and coaches respectable salaries, and if they're prepared to take losses. Having a willing partner in the city of Birmingham to help offset costs helps, and there's no denying that football players will see Fox as a great showcase if marketed and promoted correctly. I'm really curious to see what happens after the CFL season, if a lot of these guys potentially will come back down south and play in the USFL to get that kind of game tape and action in the USFL. But actions will speak louder than words. False promises are something that the public and football community experienced firsthand with the AAF, and who sold the world a bill of goods and then failed to deliver. Part of me getting the vibe, yes, there was a lot of interest in the USFL's announcement today. There could be some residual getting burned with the AAF and with the XFL having to shut its doors due to what, that could potentially have people hold off the excitement now and really wait until there's players and coaches, and maybe even waiting until after a couple games are played and live in Birmingham, Alabama in April. And that's why maybe they're going with the slow build. Plus, what is still out there, so having to manage and mitigate that, I would assume it makes it easier being in a hub city to deal with that as well. So where does the XFL stand in all of this? With the USFL directly standing in their path, well, we know the XFL is run by Redbird Capital Partners, Danny Garcia and Dwayne Johnson, and they have grand plans of their own. They have set up their own executive team for the league, and the knowledge is that they are planning on making big announcements on the league's direction, with 2022 serving as a rampway towards 2023. You can read all about those plans. Mike Mitchell has talked about those extensively. The XFL plans on being in specific markets in 2023, some of the same from 2020, but with little changes. The USFL could decide to avoid XFL markets or go to war directly by driving into the same cities the XFL inhabited a year ago. A declaration of war could, but potentially a business strategy could backfire. And Mike Mitchell updated that they released their team names, and Tampa Bay Bandits, Houston Gamblers, and New Jersey Generals are setting up shop in 2020 XFL markets. That provides the XFL ends up back in Tampa, Houston, and the tri-state area in 2023. So we've seen that before. Mike Mitchell has updated this article. So for now, the USFL has a timetable of that mid-April to June for kickoff. Where the XFL lands in, that could be different. The XFL might do late February and perhaps late April. Maybe who knows where the XFL is thinking. I think the XFL is just going at their own way and doesn't care what the USFL does. But now they're both competing with players. So once upon a time, the AAF was offering their players multiple year contracts to try and prevent them from jumping ship to the XFL. It would have created an interesting battle in the courts if players decided to play for the XFL instead, but that potential legal crisis was averted when the AAF was no more. But looks like the USFL will most certainly be in action when the XFL returns because they're backed by Fox. The USFL could try to take the same tack with their coaches and players. At the end of the day, the league that pays more will get the best available players and coaches. If the checks bounce, the employees will too. But the problem lies in, spring football has never been able to survive more than 3 seasons. And now if you have 2 leagues going at the same time, that really hinders things. We'll have to see with that. But no more sweatshop football. The Spring League got away with murder by not only having players play for free, but some paying fees to put their bodies on the line in multiple games. That kind of malpractice will not fly, of course, under the Fox banner, and it shouldn't. This is Mike Mitchell. According to sources involved in the TSL, some of the players who were promised financial compensation for competing in the TSL have still not received payment since the spring. That in itself could hurt the USFL because players talk and players know, and some of these guys might be like, well, you know what? But it is financed by Fox, but Fox was there before with the TSL last year, so it wasn't like they're on their own. That's going to be an interesting thing when it comes to the USFL and what kind of players they get. They will get good talent and they will get good players. The Spring League put on great games. McLeod Bethel Thompson is in the CFL now, and he's now the starter. I think he played in the TSL. A bunch of guys played in the TSL or were on NFL rosters and CFL rosters, so that's not a problem. But this problem that the Spring League had, we'll see how that kind of fares with the USFL in 2022. And how is this all going to play for the XFL? The one thing that interests me is that the USFL has set up shop in Tampa and Houston. Does that mean that the Vipers are moving to Orlando and the Houston Roughnecks will be in San Antonio? Or is the XFL going to go head-to-head in these markets? Or, part 3, did both sides already know where they were planting teams and are not going to go head-to-head? Because clearly The Rock and Danny Garcia, Redbird Capital, have worked with, and the people involved in Redbird have worked with Fox. They said, hey, let's just not be in the same markets, and maybe if the USFL season is good and that XFL season is good, maybe down the road, because we're not overlapping in any cities, maybe we can merge. And instead of us having 8 teams and 8 teams, we would have 16 teams. Or do what the XFL wanted to do with the CFL and have these 2 leagues play, but eventually they have a championship game and they play the 2 top teams, the top team in the USFL and the top team in the XFL. Something that no one else has talked about. We will have to find out. But Danny and The Rock are creative, and they're willing to come up with any ideas to generate interest. And that's certainly the USFL champion versus the XFL champion. Could be some interesting, that would be a fun game for spring football fans to watch. All right, we'll take a commercial break. We'll be back with your social media stuff right after this. Stay tuned, my friends.